I'd use the Shakespearean model, the measure of man, you see. It's quite interesting that the subjective aspect, when you see great literature, is as universal as any law of physics. So I think we do. The question is, what do you mean by measurement?
Yes, I mean, that's exactly what I would have said. It depends on what you mean by measurement. But if you take it literally in the scientific sense, there are fields that rely on the measurement of subjective experience. One of them is psychophysics. But it's a very limited kind of subjective experience. A psychologist named S.S. Stevens at Harvard made an entire career of this. I think, however, complicated. He was focusing mostly on sensation, the quality of sensation. But to try to focus on a complex type of experience, I think you have to turn to art and literature. I don't think we can measure those things, but we're very good at picking them up in other people. One of the things that the literature on theory of mind has articulated very elegantly and is that children learn to read other people's states of mind in a series of steps. There are various stages that they go through. Other species, for example, apes and monkeys, can do a very simple-minded, a very elementary kind of intuition of what another animal might be about to do or what it might know. But human children go through a whole series of stages which are uniquely human, and we go through a lot of our lives with a very deep understanding, most of us, of what other people feel. And in fact, we diagnose people who have a disability in this regard, sometimes as being on an autistic syndrome. So I wrote some years ago that we have evolved a brain that is exquisitely sensitive to the subjective states of other people, and that it's foolish for us to try to substitute something as simple-minded as a rating scale for that subtlety, that ability that's innate to us.
If I may, the idea that there has to be some substance to subjectivity has spawned this cottage industry of looking for that word that I dislike so much, qualia, which I don't think exists at all. And the theory is that there has to be some quantity, something you can quantify that is subjectivity. This is the granularity of subjectivity. And I despair of the field of neurophilosophy that seems to have a hebephrenic tendency to create words where their lack of imagination can't lead them.
The area where I work is at the interesting border between the use of neuroscience, the use of neurotechnologies, and all the problems that arise. Not a neurophilosopher, more of a neuroethicist. It's a huge problem. I mean, the two traditions of neuroethics are, number one, the neurological basis of moral decision-making, whatever that means, and all of the ethical issues that arise thereupon and therein. We're poised at an interesting time. Certainly, I think that much of what we're trying to do is try to generate some objective measures of subjective experience, and not just as an ambiguity, but towards particular certainties that are instrumental to what we do. Medicine, being able to articulate the role of interpersonal relationships, perhaps getting some form of interesting panpsychism where we can understand what other species are all about. Bottom line, we're not there yet. Being able to analyze and depict the activity of the brain and its mechanism is very, very different than direct first-person insight to its content. Are we striving for it? Yeah, perhaps. But we actually have the mechanism, and the mechanism is, as Dr. Moskovitz said, intersubjectivity. Now it's just a question of can we perfect that through the problems and fallacies and frailties of our relationships. Our history has suggested we have the capacity, but our history also suggests that we need to work at it.
May I just add something very briefly to this, more on the empirical side? that you can actually take these equations that describe coordination and put them in a machine and have a person interact with the machine. The beauty of that is that the person is instructed to coordinate with the machine in a particular way, but the machine parameters can be programmed to coordinate in an opposite way. When you do that experiment, I call it virtual partner interaction, or a human dynamic clamp. When you do that experiment, human beings think that the machine is screwing with them. And so in these measures of cooperation and coordination, I see a glimpse of a subjective experience.
Yes, thank you. That's a very interesting question. There's an implicit epistemology in my work. That is, epistemology is about the origins of knowledge and meaning. And the way I approach it is very similar to the way certain developmental psychologists approach it in children. I think that the bottom line in cognition in social animals is event representation. That's the currency. That's what the posterior part of the brain does. It's not looking for objects or colors or simple things like that. They're trying to understand. Even a simple insect is trying to understand an event, and in some cases, quite a complex event. I've been many times hammered by comparative biologists who defend their particular species and brilliant intellect. And the truth is that very simple brains can understand events in a certain way. And so the posterior part of the mammalian brain and the human brain is mostly devoted to putting together very complex information. I'll give you an example. You watch a dog fight, you hear sound. From a dog's point of view, there's sound, there's pain, there's taste, there's smell, there's your physiological feedback of your own body, proprioception, there's touch, there's movement, there's visual and auditory experience, all combined. So it's a multimodal, what we call a multimodal experience that has to be integrated. We used the word integration earlier, and so the binding problem really is about how you take such disparate information from so many different parts of the brain and tie it together into a single comprehension. Now, avoiding the problem of subjectivity for the moment, the question is, how do you understand that? That's an event perception. Animals can do that. They just can't get that event perception into a form that can be shared with others. And humans solved that problem, the bottleneck. And my proposal was that this went through a series of steps which increasingly widened and differentiated the types of events that we could comprehend. So that, for example, when the famous bonobo kanzi was enculturated by Susabe Jumbo, he mastered several hundred symbols, which nobody thought a bonobo could do, and a certain amount of rudimentary English. But it didn't really help him adapt to human culture. I've observed kanzi. I'm actually I was associated with that project for a while. You observe him, and what's amazing is with all of this training and enculturation, he's still very much like the other bonobos in his basic behavior. And the reason is that he can't fathom the complex events that characterize human culture. He can only get so far into it, and it's just too much to keep track of. So that's the fundamental hierarchy. And when you get up to theoretic culture, well, you're talking about things like the Big Bang. Well, that's an event, right? It's an event representation, a very elaborate event representation with the help of all sorts of tools and devices. But ultimately, that's the way the hierarchy works. And it's simply that, as it were, the structures that we've built have led us to the point where we can learn very complex things. Now, abstraction, I think, is inherent in neural systems, and there are just various degrees of it. And it's partly related to what I'm talking about, but I think abstraction may be a little bit of too simple a term to capture all of this. The relationship to morality is interesting because some people capable of extraordinary abstractions are highly immoral. Think of Martin Heidegger in Germany, who became an ardent Nazi, not simply a a sort of passive Nazi, but an active Nazi, was brought in to bring Nazism to the universities, and he did it. And many, many academics did the same thing. That's not only there, it happens all over the world, and it's not unique by any means to Germany. The thing is that abstract ability, theoretic capability, in no way guarantees morality. I think we can provide a framework for morality that way, but the enforcement of moral behavior, for the most part, is embodied in the mimetic level. It's, I like Karen Armstrong's take on religion, which is it's really not about belief, it's about practice. It's about custom, and that is where the embodied aspect of culture is so vitally important. We can't do without it. It has a tremendous amount to do with the planning and regulation of behavior and self-control. The orbital part of the frontal lobes is all about self-control, and that's particularly the inhibition of emotion and impulsivity and so on. One of the remarkable things about us, compared with apes again, is that what I'm doing right now, an ape never does. Their articulations are all emotional. Whereas language is disconnected from emotion. We're just sitting here barreling along, and ideas are flying back and forth through muscular contractions. That's our special trick. We disconnected the symbolic expression aspect of things. We can reconnect it at times, and in certain forms of art we do, for example, in operatic singing and so on. But in fact, we're capable of disconnecting. And that's one function, and the other one, of course, is planning and oversight.
Interestingly, one of the things we're learning is that humans might not be the only moral animal at all, particularly if what we then do is we take morality and we ground it to its fundamental aspects of sort of ecological relationality. That is to say, there are rules, and we recognize those rules, and we work within them. That's not to say that human morality and that of other species is in fact identical. It is not. That's also not to say that human morality across the board may be an identical phenomenon. Case in point being multiple ethical systems that provide analysis of moral decisions and also give us then systems for its articulation. That being the case, I think some of the work we're seeing that's actually coming out of Dr. Kelso's group, not alone, but also together with some of the group of, in Italy, Giacomo Rizzolatti, here in the United States, Marco Iacobono, who's doing some work with the notion of mirroring systems of neurons that are able to develop a sense of the feeling of what it is like to be the other as mirrored in one's sense. It's what some people refer to as neurohermeneutics. Also the idea of that representation of what the feeling of self is then occurring in another reflects back to Dr. Moskovitz's model of empathy, a neurobiological model of empathy that is in many ways grounded to the subjective experience of meanness and non-meanness. And of course, all of these are articulated in a variety of different hierarchical, but not necessarily mutually exclusive dimensions that we communicate, Dr. Donald's model. So one of the things we're coming to appreciate is by understanding the neural basis of both moral cognition and its articulation in our behaviors, number one, we're able to appreciate at least certain types of what I would call proto-moral actions and thought in other species, even if we in some way or another rather anthropocentrically denigrate that to just being ecological. It's a handle, it's a phrase, perhaps, but perhaps it allows us a deeper appreciation. But we're also able to understand what that means to engage in those decisions and how we describe them and how complex dynamical systems actually work, not only with regard to the individual, but the individual as nested within a complex system. With that, what I'll do is I'd like to start, if I could, with first Dr. Kelso and then shift over to Dr. Moskovitz quickly, and then also just very, very briefly end with Professor Donald to just describe and put that into context for you, if you could.
But you're not saying morality is predetermined, though.
No. I mean, I personally am not of the belief, and there are others who are, and there are a number of different orientations to this, some philosophical, some theological, and I stand not to refute them, only to come at it from a neurological perspective, neuroscientific perspective. We are, in fact, somewhat predetermined in the sense of being predisposed to be able to appreciate the actions of others, including perhaps some of their symbols, their semiotics, their expressions, and their reactions, and relate them to our own. And that becomes very important to then intuit the self-other relationality. And that's what's there. So what ends up happening is through that biological basis of predisposition, we then engage in that psychological process of ecological cognition that we then develop a more formal morality towards and engage that within our social infra and extra structures that becomes a formalized system of ethics. I hope was that clear? Okay. Gentlemen.
Well, I will take the Wittgensteinian position that I will not talk whereof I do not know. So I'd rather, we're just at the beginning of understanding how humans interact with each other, what information is used. Notice the word information is discussed here in terms of objective measures of integration, how you can put the senses together and where that is done in the brain. But notice how impoverished the description of that problem is. We're going to integrate touch with vision, but we don't talk about the motion of the hands over another person and what that feels like and so on. It's such an impoverished description. So when you raise it now to higher issues of morality and such, what would allow us an entry point into a scientific understanding of morality? This is where the complementary theme, I think, comes out in spades. As Professor Moskovitz said, it's not disease alone, it's health and disease. You have to see these things as complementarity, as complementary. And it's so insidious that we have great difficulty in doing it. So I would just make 2 points. One is that we can easily be fooled when we use this word information. And so even information for events. Let me just elaborate very briefly. The great gannet that has wings has to close before it enters the water. It's diving from a great height. You use physical measures like distance and velocity to talk about how that is done. But in fact, that's not how it's done at all. It's actually an expanding optical array across the retina from which one can pick out critical points that specify to the animal, you had better do this now, otherwise you will annihilate yourself on the surface. Now that's a very subjective kind of description, but it's scientifically proven. It's the same information that allows you to brake your car and so on, you see. But our descriptions of these events is so impoverished, and not even speaking about the first person perspective, that we can very easily get into this idea of where are things, what disparate pieces of information we have to put together, and then where would that be in the brain, and then think we understand, and actually we know nothing.
Dr. Moskovitz.
And as Tom Nagel would point out, even no matter how much you know about the gannet's perceptual apparatus and its motivational apparatus, we can never know what it is like to be a gannet. I'm going to give you as briefly as I can, a theory about this issue of the integration of brain development and moral sensibility. I tend to think of it as a function of the evolution of the capacity to experience suffering. A lot of my interest derives from my trying to understand the suffering of my patients. But if you think about mammalian evolution and what it requires to nurture a live born, there is an emotional communication that requires a capacity to experience suffering. And that is a function of a part of the brain that has been variously called the limbic forebrain or the mammalian forebrain. It's a collection of cortical and subcortical nuclei that were described by a fellow by the name of Papez that seemed to have a circuit-like function. It lends itself to this oscillatory mechanism that I described, theoretically, of course. And it is the capacity to share the suffering of others that is the basis of, at least part, of our moral intuitions. People who lack certain parts of the limbic forebrain are prone to antisocial behavior. They lack the experience of suffering. Sometimes neurosurgeons will ablate parts of the limbic forebrain in order to control chronic pain. And the patient after one of these procedures says, "Oh, the pain's still there, but it doesn't bother me." What the neurosurgeon has done is expunge the capacity to suffer in the face of a noxious stimulus. The stimulus is still there, but the experience of suffering is not. And that capacity to experience suffering, and more importantly, to share the experience of suffering intersubjectively with others, is the foundation of our moral intuition. But as I say, we can't teach that.
In the interest of time, what I'd like to do is let's have Professor Donald give you a brief response to the question. I want to entertain one more question, if I could. So please, Professor Donald.
A very brief comment, and that is that I think that it's important not to overlook the important role that culture plays in all of this. In small human groups, I think there is a case to be made for a kind of natural morality, because in very small kinship groups, which was the way we lived for most of our history, our prehistory, you're familiar with everyone in the group, and there are certain types of natural controls over behavior. The problem comes largely with urbanization and dense populations, where you have to deal with large numbers of people who are anonymous to you, and where you encounter other people who fall into different category. And it's been typical of many, many, many human cultures, in fact, probably most cultures, that if you're in the in group, you get one type of treatment, and if you're in the out group, you get various other types of moral treatment, to the point where perhaps killing you is actually going to get someone a hero medal. And in other words, there's a tendency in many groups to regard their worst enemies as less than human, and even to hunt them and sacrifice them and so on. So, and slavery was, a common, universal phenomenon in the urbanization process in human beings. So culture plays an enormous role, and at one point or another, given these natural propensities that we have, culture must come up, as it were, with a collectively learned scheme for enforcing morality, and that's really what I was trying to address in this multi-level approach. I wrote a book about 8 or 9 years ago on consciousness. It's called A Mind So Rare, and it does take, it's a very complicated book, for which I apologize, but there is a very rich literature. I mean, when I told an old friend of mine, Jerry Bruner, that I was going to do this, he said, "You must like pain if you want to write a book on consciousness." The truth is that I think, in my own opinion, there are a number of different kinds of definition of consciousness, and they're all valid. I wrote a paper years ago that there were 3 categories of consciousness: state definitions, such as you altered states with drugs, sleep, waking, and so on. And then there are what are called representational definitions, which come out of usually the humanities, which have to do with the cultural understanding that we have of certain things. America suddenly becomes aware of something, coffee, let's say, and suddenly everybody becomes very good at making coffee, where previously they were indifferent to it and so on. And then there are what are called architectural definitions, which are very typical of psychology and cognitive science, which treat consciousness as a sort of phase in brain processing, almost a place in the brain in certain categories of theory. And Barr's was mostly focused on architectural structures. The humanistic treatments focus mostly on representational structures of consciousness. And The comparative studies that have been done and physiological studies, for the most part, are state studies. They look at altered states and so on. And these are all valid, and if you put them all into a sort of evolutionary hierarchy, you can come up with a multi-level evolutionary approach, which I've tried, and which even has a very large role for culture. And the reason I bring that up is a just very succinct comment. I spent some time studying people who are both deaf and blind, and particularly the case of Helen Keller. I was at Harvard at the time, and my wife and I went to the Perkins archives and went through a whole bunch of stuff, but also other related cases. And the interesting thing is that in the case of Helen Keller, she was blind and deaf from the age of 18 months, didn't acquire language, had no concept that language existed, which is usually the case if you're isolated that way, until she was brought by a very clever teacher into a point who focused her attention, went through a long, very difficult